So, Dave, and I don't want to. I suppose I maybe could find some arguments, maybe with the Department of Justice and maybe a couple other places. But it seems to me there has been no greater pick to be a cabinet secretary to oversee an agency from the perspective of wanting someone who can not only debilitate the agency, can not only undercut its mission, but is really an expert at it than Scott Pruitt. Just before we get into the way in which he's going about this project at the EPA, give us a little bit, for people who aren't familiar or can't remember his background, give us a little sense of who Scott Pruitt was before he was the head of the EPA.
Sure. He was the Attorney General in Oklahoma for many years, and I think briefly for a few years was the head of the Republican Attorney General Association. And his mission in life, his professional mission in life from the very beginning has been suing EPA. He sued the EPA something like 14 times as Oklahoma Attorney General. He was one of this kind of small group of Republican attorneys general who were just fixated on blocking EPA, reducing EPA's power, and protecting the oil and gas industry from the EPA. So you're right. From Donald Trump's perspective, he really is. He is perfect. He's been he's a sworn enemy of the EPA, and he's been tangling with it for years. So he knows where the bodies are buried.
And this was a guy who's, I think, one of the co-chairmen of his reelect campaign. One of his reelect campaigns was Harold Hamm, who is one of the biggest, one of the pioneers of fracking, and one of the biggest natural gas CEOs in the country. I mean, just to give a sense. So it's not just that he feels strongly about this. It's that he is of this ilk.
Oh yeah, he's very, very tight with the oil and gas industry, and has been in Oklahoma. I mean, the functional distinction between this group of Republican attorneys general and the oil and gas industry, the line between them is very, very fuzzy. You know, it's a revolving door situation. People go back and forth. They're basically on the same team. They're functionally indistinguishable.
So, okay, so this guy gets appointed to be the head of the EPA. We know that Steve Bannon has said that the Trump administration's, or one of the Trump administration's big projects is the deconstruction of the administrative state. Give us, before we go into how he's doing this, give us a sense of, like, what's the EPA supposed to do? Right? I mean, we call it the EPA. It's the Environmental Protection Agency. What's it supposed to do? What's the theory behind this agency?
Well, this is actually quite interesting, and I don't think it's actually very well understood in American politics. But EPA was founded back in this sort of high watermark of environmental policy in the U.S. in the 60s and 70s, and shortly thereafter, these foundational environmental laws were passed: the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Endangered Species Act. All the ones that we're still drawing on today. And the interesting thing about those laws is that they were written intentionally to be very, very open-ended. They're written, like the Clean Air Act, for instance, various parts of it say, in effect, EPA will regulate anything that's in the air that's harmful to humans, right? So it was written in this sort of open-ended way precisely so that EPA scientists could stay abreast of current science and current threats and update EPA regulations as new science came in. So this idea that you hear from Pruitt and a lot of people on the right these days, this sort of attempt to drag this kind of constitutionalism and small government rhetoric over into EPA is just wildly diametrically wrong. The EPA was designed to have very open-ended, expansive powers that changed and grew over time. That's precisely what it was designed to do, and so it has. As EPA scientists have discovered that certain pollutants are more threatening at smaller amounts than they thought, EPA has updated its regulations as they discovered new things in the air that threatened human beings, like, say, greenhouse gases. They updated EPA's regulations to cover those. So what EPA is supposed to do at the most fundamental level is ensure that every single American enjoys the fundamental right to clean air and water in a clean environment. That sounds absolutely radical today, but in the 70s, in the 60s and 70s, at the sort of height of liberalism, this was considered the obvious next step for American democracy.
I mean, it's embedded in the name, right? I mean, it could have been the Environmental Cleanup Agency if it was just a one-off job that it was supposed to perform once and not evolve, but it would be the functional equivalent of saying, well, when we started the police force in this country, people only had revolvers, not semi-automatics. So we're not going to police that. Or
right. Yeah. I mean, and this is something that was a truism, right? Sort of understood by everybody, including Republican administrators of the EPA, up until the sort of turn to radicalism in the GOP in the last couple of decades. But even some of the earliest Republican heads of the EPA did not consider this a liberal versus conservative thing. They thought that a citizen of an advanced democracy had a right to sort of a basic level of health in their environmental circumstances. It wasn't controversial back then.
What do you think? What do you think was the big turning point? I mean, obviously, we're going to talk about the way in which Scott Pruitt is going about this. But what do you think the turning point was? I mean, was it a sense? Was there a change in the assessment of how endangered the profits were from companies who were poisoning the environment? Or was there actually a change in the culture of those people, of those industries that has radicalized them?
I don't think in the end it really has to do with costs to industry, because the history of EPA, for anyone who's followed it, is this eternally recurring cycle where they propose regulations, the businesses involved, say the sky is going to fall, say it's going to destroy the economy, say it's going to drive them bankrupt, then the regulations go into effect and everyone's fine. Everyone gets healthier, we save billions of dollars in healthcare costs, and everything's fine, and the economy continues expanding, and the businesses survive just fine. That's happened over and over and over again. So it's not really an empirical thing. It's ideological. And I would say it's not even anything specific to environmental policy. It's just been swept up in the larger polarization of the last several decades. That's all there is to it. It's just become associated, like all sort of activist government policy has become associated with Democrats. And over time, as the intellectual kind of foundation of U.S. conservatism has rotted away, all that's left are these sort of atavistic impulses, and one of them is EPA bad, right? It's a tool that Democrats use to punish our people, and so anything they do with it, we want to undo. That's all that's left of kind of the intellectual case.
It's a tribal signifier, if you will.
100% now.